All right, so this is the second video in the series, and as I addressed in the prior video, this is essentially going to be where I talk about Hegel's speculative method. So the speculative method essentially is divided into three parts, or there are three movements, as equally as there are three moments. So the three, or I guess you could say stages of the speculative method are called the understanding, dialectical reason, and speculative reason. And the understanding is essentially, as I had talked about prior, it is similar in spirit to Kant's, what he called the understanding, but Hegel specifically calls the understanding as any kind of finite propositional sort of statements that we generally kind of make about truth, what the nature of things are, and these qualities essentially state something that is immediate and distinctionless. So what the understanding essentially does as a movement is that it takes content prior to it and it recombines it specifically into a one unity, but this unity is an abstract unity, right? I said it's an immediacy, so there's only one. So technically you could represent this conceptually as a circle. Let me see if I can, right, first start with a circle. But then if we are essentially considering something as a finite proposition, then we find that we have a problem. Or what is this problem? Well, this problem is specifically what the understanding tries to do, or that it combines things into an abstraction. Well, in those abstractions, it essentially takes things together and you have a one unity. But as far as essentially knowing what the nature of this thing is, you're not really grasping what it is in its complexity. So you essentially have something that, or in Hegel's language, it is less determinate or less complex, basically. So when we posit something, the understanding is essentially a one-sided determination, or one-sided proposition. And that one-sidedness implies it's negative. So there is always a division of something where you have, okay, well, let's call this A, and we'll call this A, and then we call this A negative. So this is essentially kind of what it looks like. But there is another interesting development here, that we are also projecting, or simultaneously, when we are thinking about something in its immediacy, we are essentially looking inside it, or unpacking its contents. So there is a two projections that essentially go from this immediacy than to this one-sided proposition, which implies it's negative. So you have this moment where you have this immediacy and then you have its opposite. So the two are essentially mediated. All right, and it is this mediation that you can equally say, or you begin to have a problem, and this problem, hold on a second. Right. And this problem is that, and this whole movement as a whole is what the understanding does, essentially. And you can kind of think about this in a certain way as you have these two movements or two projections which imply a conceptual division. So this movement, these two movements are the division, and this one movement here is eminence. So the division itself of the one side and the opposite side, which are themselves both opposite and also the same, you can see it in this movement, in this mediation between the two, or this mediation is already internal to or implied by the original statement made by the understanding. So let me indicate this. Dang. And more seriously, we could essentially say that this proposition is unequal to itself at that point. And in order for there to be any kind of distinction or mediation of that kind, you're essentially saying that this is not that, but in so doing, or you have these two opposite determinations, but they are united in their opposition, so they form a unity of opposites. And you can also equally think of an analogy for this as, and this is also something which I believe makes this quite clear, is that if you have like a cylinder or something, you have two circles or two things at the end of the cylinder, but if you look at the cylinder from the point of view from the side, you see that there is a distinction. Okay, so there's this side, there's this side, and then there's also this. So you see a distinction, and they're opposing each other. But also that they are mediated, or there is something in between them, which is the mediation, or what connects the circles. But if you rotate it another way, you just see the circle. And this is essentially what the understanding is like. You're not seeing the whole thing. You're not seeing the whole mediation. You're just seeing one side of it. And that one side also would apply the other side, right? So if you're looking at it from this perspective, from the different sides, that is essentially the sameness part, same, but they're also opposite from each other. So I think the cylinder analogy is quite descriptive here, right? But however, and by the way, this is write that there. This is dialectical reason, or the dialectic moment. But we can't just sort of say and stop here with the mediation, because we just sort of have a spurious alternating back and forth between the A and the not A, between this and its opposite, but they're also the same, so they're in contradiction. So we can't really just stop here at the contradiction. And we can't move back also because, we already, this is what was already implied by the understanding, right? So we can't go backwards, so we have to think of can't go backwards, we can't just stay here, so we have to go forwards. All right, and the way to go forwards here, and let me just write this here. Let me just, and there is this and this. Just trying to get it right. Okay, and this is essentially the move of what speculative reason does. Now we have here the opposite movement. Right. Okay. Oops. Reason. Okay. My apologies. All right, so this is the complete diagram here. So if you see there is the spurious alternation, we capture this alternation here, or we see the whole movement, right? Because we see that the conjunction of these terms, that is itself the mediation. The terms are mediated; they're not equal to themselves, but in so doing, they're also the same. And so, if you capture this whole disjunction and elevate it, but you're not changing the elevation. You're recollecting all these terms, and that's kind of what the disjunction here does. So you're combining these. You're including this side into here and including this side into here, and already this retroactively applies this mediation, right? So we now have a self-mediation that we're including these terms, and they're opposed, but they are also unified in their opposition. But we're also looking for something new, something that was missing that we couldn't previously conceive of, or that couldn't have been revealed at all if you hadn't really gone through this whole movement in the method to begin with. So in this sense, speculative reason isn't just like a synthesis. Synthesis in the sense that, the terms, the two opposite terms are indeed included, but they are also canceled. You don't have the contradiction anymore. You are looking for the third term, which essentially resolves this ceaseless modulation between the two terms, which they each posit each other as being different, and each, by saying that they're different, they effectively say that they're the same, right? Because that is essentially the nature of what a dialectic is. And so when you have this move, you have a complex of three terms, or you could call it four terms if you consider it the negation of negation. So you could read it as one whole movement, that's one, the method itself is one. Or you could see it as essentially two, this to this is what the move of the understanding, and then this is the move of reason, right? And then you have understanding, reason, and then back to understanding. And then this also recaptures what was being said earlier about the understanding. It essentially takes that whole complex of terms or surplus that was produced by speculative reason and then recombines it back into a finite proposition. And this is essentially what Hegel calls Aufhebung, or what is sometimes translated in English as sublation. And sublation means that something is preserved. You had the inclusions there in the previous diagram. The terms are canceled in the sense that you no longer have the contradiction that came before because you have the new term, the surplus. But you are also elevating it to a higher level, and this elevation is really means an elevation of complexity, because you aren't just sort of eliminating those terms. You are combining, or you're finding from a basic identity, and then through that identity implies the difference between the two identities, each being itself, but in each trying to claim their own identity, there becomes difference. And then you have the third term, which recollects or reconciles the two, and you have a complex of three terms, which is then reduced back to a finite proposition. But we're not going backwards here. We're still going forwards all the way. And this is essentially something that Hegel is developing throughout the entire logic. And the logic itself also grows and develops from each of these determinations. And so in the next video, I'll talk more specifically about the science of logic, or how the speculative method develops from each part, from being to essence, and to lastly to concept. Right? So I'll see you then.